Good morning, everyone. I'm Neil Brenner, Professor of Urban Theory here at the GSD, and welcome to second day of our Urban Planning and Design Conference on Conditions and Projections. Good to see such a great turnout on a Saturday morning. And the agenda of this panel is, as you know, regulatory practices, which I think is a key dimension of theory and practice in relation to the production of the built environment. I mean, obviously, all forms of planning and design occur within a context that is massively structured by various kinds of rules and regulations associated with state institutions. So in order to think about the possibilities for planning and design, we absolutely need to deal with state strategies and state institutions. And just as crucially, it seems to me, the nature of the institutions and strategies and regulations that we're dealing with, they change over time, sometimes in very profound ways. So just as strategies of planning and design change, so too do the formations of regulation within which design and planning strategies are situated. So it's kind of a double dynamic, and it seems to me that's a big part of what we want to open up for investigation and discussion in this morning's first panel. So truly delighted to have two very distinguished presenters this morning. The first presenter will be Henk Oink, who is Vice Director General and Director of National Spatial Planning for the Dutch Ministry of Infrastructure and the Environment. He is responsible for the development of the new Dutch spatial planning policy, the architecture policy on architecture and spatial design, the new Spatial Planning Act, several long-term plans and studies, including the Randstad 2040 Structural Vision and the Dutch Spatial Olympic Strategy, and furthermore for the R&D agenda on spatial planning. And he holds two academic chairs at the University of Utrecht and the TU Delft, and different research projects. He's doing different research projects on sustainability, spatial planning, governance, and design. And our second presenter is Tauris Arouse, an architect and professor in architectural history and conservation at the Institute of Form, Theory, and History. And she teaches conservation, the master's design studio Restore, and the post-professional master's in conservation and urbanism. She's also a founding member of the Oslo Center for Critical Architectural Studies, and she's a leader of the 4-year international research project, Place and Displacement Exhibiting Architecture, which is funded by the Norwegian Research Council 2011 to 2014, and she's authored many publications in different journals and books. So without further ado, I'm delighted to turn it over to Henk, who's going to be our first presenter.
Thank you. I am responsible for 2 chairs, actually for 5. But why would you elaborate on the numbers? I don't hold them myself. That's the fun part of politics. I want to talk a little bit and elaborate on the political side of my responsibility when it comes to planning and design. It starts with politics. And politics is a rare notion when it comes to planning. We heard yesterday's discussion about the mirror, and it attracted me because my first image was the face-off image of the movie, is that you have to be schizophrenic to be inside bureaucracy. Perhaps I am, but you have to be good at it, because politics is all about power. Politics, in that sense, is hard to seduce to be interested in content. So if power takes over, where is content? So for me, I would say my biggest ambition and task is to actually keep double-track politics planning into position. So it's not a one-dimensional way of making policy, developing strategies, making rules and regulations, but it's also finding out every day, again and again, a sidestep, a next level, a double track outside of politics. Design, in that sense, helps, but also complicates. If we talk about design, I'm not talking about the object, that's the result of design, I want to talk about planning and design and the process. For me, and for the Netherlands, and that's this longer tradition as we know it, planning through politics, while we know politics is only interested in the yellow arrow, only interested in an effective approach, an effective strategy of getting from today to tomorrow, planning and double-track planning actually makes it possible to start on a broader perspective. Remember where you come from. Bring in the yesterday of this perspective and combine this with a lot of scenarios, a lot of future perspectives to be actually effective. This perspective on planning, bringing it on a political table, I think it's easy said, but every time it's hard to get. Process. If you look at the challenges and the response in this short-term action, there's a disconnect. So my politics of planning is a day-to-day balancing act. Back to the Netherlands. We all know this picture, and if you don't, I will explain. This is Jacoba Mulder and Cornelis van Eester, very famous urban designers, planners in the Netherlands, actually working on the Amsterdamse Bos. And the Amsterdamse Bos, very much a qualitative space, a picture of yesterday. It's snowing now, it's minus 17 degrees Celsius. You don't want to be there. And the Amsterdamse Bos is a qualitative space within the vicinity of the region of Amsterdam, the metropolitan region of Amsterdam, the city. It was not intended as a public space. It was intended as a labor project. Crisis, the 30s. A little bit like we are now, but the Netherlands, we don't have unemployment, so why would we invest in labor projects? But at that time, we had a lot of unemployment, and we needed people to get to work. So the labor, the social drive behind the project, getting people to work, was combined with the ambition of the city of Amsterdam, combined with the political ambition to actually add quality, to add qualitative space, and to put design not on the designer's table, but on the political table. So design was not only an instrument to develop a city, but design was an instrument for politics. That's why I show this picture, that in that time design was actually used and exploited through designers and politicians to make a better society or an idea of an ideal society. The second thing about this picture is that design was considered in a different way. When this picture was published, Mrs. Mulder excused herself for the picture. She was not wearing a white coat, and design at that time was considered a scientific and academic job as well as a political task. So we're good at planning our cities. We've done this through the years. Here you can see the historical development of the Netherlands, and if you compare it to our southern neighbors, you actually know that we know how to plan, and they don't. Although we like parts of what's happening in the southern part, because on one hand you can actually see in the Netherlands the development of the growing of cities. It's a network of cities and smaller villages within this greener structure. There's no way you can think of a green heart in a Randstad. This is just a political idea. But the sprawl way of development in Belgium also has a flip side when it comes to how are we planning our individual houses, how are we planning our individual buildings. In Belgium that's much more an entrepreneurial act, while in the Netherlands it's much more a governmental act. So there's the pros and contras on this small scale between Belgium and the Netherlands. We are a network of cities connected through a pretty much qualitative infrastructure when it comes to roads, rails and water. But we function on a regional scale, as everywhere else. And to make this function, we developed this huge complex of policy ideas on how to plan our country. And with the last government, not this one, but the last government, we actually, of course, discovered again and again that every cry of pain in society, every help of anyone in the Netherlands, immediately resulted in the reaction of a rule, a regulation, or a policy document. And although every cry of pain, every cry of help, of course in itself was right, the answer, the reaction, making a rule, adds up, as you can see on the left, in too many different ways of looking at our landscape. So I did a research with Adriaan Geuze, the picture on the right, where we actually tried to develop a new perspective on what this landscape actually is. Not a map of 7 or 9 different colors, because if you actually walk, cross from red to green, you don't know that you crossed this border. There's no evidence in landscape that it actually changed. So we developed a map where we walked and biked and did research. And the landscape is also starting within the white spots on the smaller grain. And it's different there on the different colors. So policy is not an answer to the qualitative aspect of this landscape. More policy or more rules and regulations is the last answer that you should give when it comes to that. Well, we all know this. It's crisis and we have big challenges. And I don't need to convince you of this, but I need to talk about Europe a little. Because we are now on the other side of the ocean and Europe is actually in a totally different stage. Politically, you can read it in the papers. I'm not sure actually if you read anything about Europe in the papers here, but we do. We're talking a lot with each other in Europe. The borders of our countries are getting thicker in that sense instead of opener. Even in a formal way, I was shocked that we were always thinking that the protectionist approach on a political level was something not in a European thing, but you can actually see that when it comes to trade, when it comes to people, our borders are thickening. We're shrinking. We're the only continent in the world that's actually shrinking. We're aging as fast as anyone else, you can see on the right. And so all this non-adding of people and this closing of our borders makes our development task, why we are here, only about the existing. We don't add new. We only have to take care of the existing. Redevelop Europe. And then if you look at the Netherlands in this European context, we're filthy. We produce a lot of CO2, produce a lot of waste, eat up a lot of energy, pollute. We are a dense country with low dense cities, lots of cars, lots of factories still. We have lots of water problems. 62% of the Netherlands is affected by the sea. So we're in this prosperous delta with a beautiful history of planning and design, with cities that flourish and low unemployment rate. And at the same time, this is the flip side. But there's hope when it comes to the development. That's the middle picture. There's no growth in Europe, or hardly any. There's decline demographically, except for in Almere. So we still have a new town, a city that is growing. That might give us hope. in this complex task. So we're in this era of crisis complexity where lots of issues pressure us to thicken our borders and narrow our perspective. And it turns out that the only way we do this in a political sense is that we become nostalgic. We look back, and looking back actually takes away the possibility for us to perceive, predict, and investigate and research our future. So we have a problem. Because it's not only on the political side, it's not only on the societal side of the table that looking back and becoming nostalgic is the closest perspective there is. It's also in the professional debate. It's also amongst planners and designers. So if that's the case, who can help us out? So we're in the midst of this mix-up. Well, we are behaving strange as species, we all know this. We're urbanizing rapidly. It hasn't happened on this scale before. If you make drawings of this, of climate change, then urbanization is looking at a totally different graph. So, is there the solution? If you know that 75% of the world will live in cities, earning 90% of our GDP, only 4% of the world's surface. If this was a business I would invest my money in. Is this where we're heading? Is this the place where confrontation, innovation and differences all collide on a different level, on a different scale? You see it in the Netherlands, you see it in Europe. So is it the regional scale that will bring us solutions out of this complexity, out of this perspective of looking back? But at the same time we have to look back, because Europe's development is only about the redevelopment of the existing. And then the urban agenda for this redevelopment in this European perspective becomes very important. How do we deal with it in the Netherlands? Triple-wise. On one hand we say good government. A government that's interested and responsible for visions, for instruments and rules and regulations, and the execution of qualitative projects that really add to society. The second line is strong alliances, so connect with others, specific, alternate, public, private, with knowledge partners, with businesses. And the third is design. Design not only as a tool, as an instrument, but also as a process. Good government starts here. Good government also embraces the specific engineering, knowing that a national government, for a national government, it's terribly complicated to become specific. Because the only thing you could actually rule out in rules and regulations become very generic. So we test out our whole complex of rules and regulations, take out 70% of it, and reinvent the specificness of ruling and planning our country on the national level. That ended now, or at least this is the current situation, in a new, the 6th plan on spatial planning and development for the Netherlands, where we deregulated and decentralized lots of our issues, but at the same time embraced and enforced 13 goals of national interest. They're all investigated, they're all tested, they're all ground-based, they're all combined, and they're all confronted in this one document. So this is where the strict responsibility is made explicit. And at the same time, we open up this complex of rules and regulations, this complex of making policy, for regions to develop. The second is alliances. And that's the hard one, because an alliance is by definition formed by actors, organizations, people who are interested in a common goal. So to get to the common, they take out their differences, or at least minimize them. But at the same time, alliances are hard to trust, because an alliance is only an excuse out of the institutional reality that you're in. The only way why you want to collaborate at the moment is the dysfunctioning of the current situation. So the alliance is appealing as a way to deliver, and at the same time the alliance also becomes the mirror of the non-functioning of this institution. For me, it means that in this perspective of double tracks planning, can we embrace the alliance to actually change the institutional instead of only bringing us new development? And the third is design. Design actually connects the three corners of this triangle. On one end, it develops the analysis for the technique, the base in order, everything in place, every project with its execution process. And at the same time, integrates all these different projects into a perspective of opportunities. But when politics comes into design, ambition adds to this perspective. So, by making good projects, it's technique and opportunities. By making politics and redesigning the institutional, it's the adding of the political ambition within the design process. And we do this, and did this, with our designers in the past, and we do this again with the designers of today. But this is not a one-way track. This is not about installing a lab and that you're there. This is not about inviting all the stars of the world on the stage of the Elysee and saying that design is in position. They never return. It's about the narrative of design and embracing the narrative of design into your policy, but at the same time into your politics. This is Mark Wallinger in the National Gallery in Berlin. He was a bear for a couple of weeks. Why I show this picture is that after a couple of days, he was only there at night. People left food in daytime. You could see he's not a bear. Anyone knew, but still they did. So can design actually address this narrative? Can design on a political level? Can politics believe again in a narrative of design? OMA made this proposition for an energy circle in the North Sea, wind farming. This is not there. This is a proposition. A proposition, of course, made with a collaboration with science. A proposition, of course, made with a collaboration with businesses. But it was a design proposition that you could actually think of a new way of taking care of your energy production. No one was interested on a political level, except for the Belgian. You know where they are? Here. This is the Belgian coast. And the Belgian Minister of Economic Affairs actually invited Rem Koolhaas and said, I want to bring you to Europe with this plan. Because I think it will break us out. We will not realize this ring of windmills, but it will break us out of our condition and perspective. So policy for design. How do we do that? We have a culture of design. A culture of design installed and instituted in policy. With 4 aspects. One of them is disconnect between bureaucrats, politics, and the design approach was addressed, and we installed Wouter van Stiphout as professor on design and politics at TU Delft. We have a collaboration with the Architecture Institute, and I'm co-curating at the International Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam. And we do research on design and politics with 010 publishers. Number 5 just was published. We now redo our design policy. Again in 2 tracks, on a formal way, on the political table with the national government and all the ministries in place, and at the same time on this second track of the Biennale, of the TU Delft and the NIA. It's about the excellence, it's about key projects, it's about this double track and conditions. And since I'm running out of time, I will speed up a little. One part of the excellence I have to stipulate. The excellence of a national government, of politics, has to be adaptive and uncertain. And it's perhaps the hardest part when it comes to politics. Because uncertainty and adaptiveness doesn't get you into parliament or into your chair. But it makes a sustainable strategy on a political level. So how bridge the gap between adaptiveness and elections? Change the perspective from defense to offense. If you position this towards the design practice, then the engineering part is the defense, while the design part is the offense. This is our design agenda, I'm not going to get into it. And the next is the double track. We do this now through the International Architecture Biennale in Rotterdam. Me being a co-curator of the Biennale, one of the team, actually made it very complex for politics to acknowledge how to deal with it. So I proposed to actually submit to the International Architecture Biennale 7 national projects, key projects of national interest. The Biennale is a Biennale where 3 main sites, Rotterdam, Sao Paulo and Istanbul, and 27 counter sites from all over the world, test and reflect on making city and how it works. And what we did as a national government, actually proposed 7 projects on this research table. I never thought it was possible that projects that are in the midst of negotiation, projects that have to deal with financial negotiation with other stakeholders, could actually be on this research table called the Biennale. But they are the Zuidas, South Axis, Central Business District in Amsterdam, is now in the midst of a final decision on billions of euros to invest. And at the same time, students from Yale, BAA and the TU Delft are cutting and slicing it through from all sides and putting this analysis, putting this design perspective on the same political table as where the decision making is now taking place. So this confrontation out of a design perspective within the negotiation on political table is actually possible. I think this is the strongest example at the moment within a liberal government of the Netherlands, where it's still possible to position design and reflection when it comes to decision making. Almere, Rotterdam Zuid, the Rhine-Meuse Delta, the metropolitan landscape, transit-oriented development, and the Olympics in the Netherlands. So these key projects, through the Biennale, I could explore on them, but I'll wait. The second is that we keep our chair at the TU Delft on design as politics. And my question is, if we want this policy, if we want this brave politics, or sometimes courageous, at least vulnerable and adaptive, if we know the situation changed and the redevelopment of the European condition is the only development there is, then how about our educational institutions? Do we educate our students for this new reality, for the other issues, for this changing perspective? What is the urban agenda in the European perspective? How are our schools and universities actually addressing this new way of positioning design? I think for schools and universities in Europe, there's no way out. They have to exploit, they have to embrace double-track politics and design as does politics. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henk. And next up is Tauris.
Okay. First, thank you for inviting me. I will look into the issue of regulatory practices through and urban design through the prism of heritage. I will speculate on the condition of heritage today. Should I talk in that one or in this one? Okay, so I should really and if I have time, I will also go into kind of issues of education in the end. Heritage objects today, monuments, city quarters, regions, landscapes and natural habitats comprise an even greater proportion of our physical environment. This increase can be understood both in terms of democratization and of consumption. Coupled to tourism, heritage has grown into an event industry of an unparalleled scale and scope. The heritage monument has become integrated into pervasive visual culture, whereas as an image, and here I really want to underline that we have to understand in one way the heritage monument today as an image that triggers desires and fantasies. Place-bound, the heritage monuments act as an agent in the marketing of cities and as areas as desirable objects for culture consumption in situ. These two last images has been by the artist Thomas Struth, who's been looking into the kind of working of the museum. And here I just want you to note when he makes a portrait of Notre Dame, the queues to get into this building today. I don't know if I got this little, this is the. So, I mean, if you want to enter this building as a historical object, you have to line up. If you want to make a fast track, you actually go into this building as was originally intended to worship it. But today a big issue in heritage is how you kind of deal with these new worshippers, how you organize the kind of cult of this building in some way. On another level, the heritage monument has become, so on another level, the past today creates a strong force for social engagement that traverse contemporary society. heritage and conservation now engage in the various expressions, wide and diverse groups. No longer just an obscure passion of antiquarians, the old is taken care of in increasingly ambitious and widespread fashion. Every region, culture, or object now has its own society or museum, carefully protecting and documenting its specific touchstone. I mean, today it seems always, if something is under threat, if something is on its way disappearing, it's always a group ready to save it. And the use, and here I want to underline use, of history takes on varied forms, from international cross-culture campaigns aiming to rescue objects in danger, to local preservation societies and grassroots movements working to save heritage objects, to in one way, today the production of historical imagery through advanced reenactment of historical events. And this image is from a group that I've been working with a bit, who called Alternative City, who was a protest group that in the 1970s in Stockholm succeeded to bring in huge audience. I mean, you should note the kind of list this young man has. It's all the kind of protest list against taking down buildings in the center of Stockholm. And they succeeded in some way with a kind of critique towards kind of the urban planning system, but also a critique against how the past was used to alter the whole kind of urban planning of this inner core. So here we can see kind of grassroots movements who come up and kind of change actually urban planning. A kind of early example of a kind of international gathering to help a city beyond in some way the idea of nation was, of course, in 1966, Venice was flooded together with Florence, and this was the first time, one of the first times, the international community was coming together and saving this as a city that it stated was important for mankind as a whole. And this is the kind of beginning in some way of also UNESCO's engagement in heritage. Two very different and contemporary actions in kind of using history. This is an amazing project done by Jeremy Deller, who is an artist. He actually got Turner Prize for this. And this is a reenactment of a coal miners' strike from 1984. And here's a kind of interesting crossover between kind of artist activities and also heritage. Jeremy Deller contacted Howard Giles, who is like he's like a typical kind of British kind of heritage guy in kind of tweed cap and tweed jacket, who has been working with the English heritage for a lot of years. And then he started working with bringing in more people into the different kind of castles and big houses. And he realized in that kind of, he became like an event expert, starting with kind of reenactments, weddings and so on. And he saw that this was quite a profitable project. So he jumped out of national heritage, English heritage, and started his own event firm who helps kind of film production. And Jeremy Deller contacts him, and together they do a kind of amazing reenactment of this very complex event in the kind of political history of the UK. But they gather both, the background is that it was a long kind of was a long strike that ended up in a very strong conflict where actually the miners were chased by the police through the city. And the reenactment of this event needs, of course, an enormous amount of research into very, very detailed. That is Howard Giles was expert on. What was the jacket they were wearing? How were they moving through the city? All the kind of details of research. And it was also a kind of nearly therapeutic event where some of the coal miners who'd been here from the beginning started crying to relive this event. So this is a very, very different kind of use of history. Here's when they start. Here one can really see that it's kind of probably didn't look like it was in the beginning. There's too few of them running and things like that. But the kind of reenactment of this is I think, an amazing event. And I have a PhD student now working with reenactment as a kind of new relationship in some way to the use of history, specifically looking at the media of film in relationship to that. The investment in heritage is extensive. The past appears a material for culture production on a scale that can't be ignored. And there is a quality of scaling in this development of heritage, both as an object and as a cult. In an inverted magnitude, The monumental is discovered in the minute and insignificant, at the same time as the generous notion of the monument miniatizes the large, whose cities, industrial sites and landscapes are framed in the name of memory and turned into heritage objects. The expansion of the monument from object to full environments to processes points towards two fundamental areas of change. On one side, a shift in local politics of heritage from roughly around 1970s widens and becomes inclusive, driven at large by local activism. On the other, internationalization of heritage politics through the development and reinforcement of international charters and agreement. And when the idea of a universal approach to the problem of urban settlement was lost with the kind of end of CM in 1959, one can note that the utopian notion of regulating the world's built environment according to universal applicable strategies was reborn in the development heritage framework of UNESCO. Preservation people meet. They have big kind of gatherings and they write charters. We have the famous Athens Charter of 31, 2 years before the Athens Charters of Corbusier. The Venice Charter of 1964, who established the idea about international heritage, and the ongoing development of charter. The last one, the Bura Charter, for example, from 1981. And they continue this kind of idea of being able to formalize and agree internationally on how objects should be restored, identified as heritage, and preserved. The proposal for a World Heritage Convention was launched in 1972 at the United Nations Conference on Human Environment in Stockholm, and this is an image from that. The proposal was later adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO on the 16th of November in Paris the same year as the Convention concerning the protection of world culture and natural heritage. And here is the first time the idea about the word heritage comes in. It has a prehistory, but it's kind of formalized here. The Human Environment Conference, the Stockholm meeting, as it was later to be named, was the first United Nations conference on the environment. It was groundbreaking both in scale and ambition, with representatives from 113 countries as well as representatives from many international non-governmental organizations, intergovernmental organizations, and many other specialized agencies. It was an unparalleled international gathering that took place in Stockholm on the 2 hot summer weeks in 1972. Colored by political conflict and debate, the conference laid without hesitation the foundation for action in environmental issues on an international level. But crucially also, the environmental problem that dominated the meeting led to wider public awareness of the notion of an environmental crisis. The frame of the Human Environment Conference in Stockholm pointed to a new aspect and urgency of transnational cooperation that would have an effect both on the notion and the role of cultural property. The identification of an environmental crisis affected the Earth beyond borders, which suggests the need for international agencies beyond nations that work not just to conserve individual environments and habitats, but the environment as such. And this kind of notion of crisis has very much affected the building up of UNESCO's World Heritage. It's the kind of background that it is a crisis, an urgency. We need to save and we need to do it quickly. The US was the first country that signed the convention in 1973, and in 1975, with 20 members countries, the convention was ratified. A few were non-Western countries, but generally the World Heritage List was a European affair. Today, 188 countries from all parts of the world have agreed to follow the obligations relating to identifying and protecting culture and natural heritage. It's a kind of moral imperative. In 1978, 12 objects were assigned World Heritage status and included in the new World Heritage List. And here I could talk a long time about the whole idea of forming a list. And the objects on the list are now reaching an impressive number of 936, and they kind of increase all the time, they expand all the time. And it has been turning into a kind of global open-air museum. And I should note that UNESCO have their own kind of travel agencies that help people to kind of travel around to visit this different kind of heritage. So kind of global open-air museum. The extension now that has been working very much in UNESCO now is the notion of intangible heritage, who expand the notion of the monument even further. In 2003, UNESCO adopted the idea about a convention for the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage. And El Fna, the fantastic square in Marrakesh, was the first kind of object that was identified as a kind of intangible heritage. It was a masterpiece of oral and intangible heritage. And here it's also extremely interesting. But here one wants to preserve the change. It is an issue that one identified this as a kind of that this is. It's actually interesting because there was a conference in 1997 who was taking place just near here by UNESCO, and the people crossed this square every day. So they kind of decided this was a kind of interesting case to bring out as the first test case for what an intangible heritage can be. And here I want to preserve the kind of this changing of this square from in the morning when it works as market to when it becomes like a more festive place, when it becomes restaurants and so on in the evening. And the way to do that is, of course, extremely complex. And they have worked very much with starting to create educational thing, that it should educate kids in the school about this kind of traditional fortune telling and instead of it's transcribing histories through storytelling. And this, of course, is impossible. At the time it's kind of been formalized, it also loses its kind of tradition in some way. And it become, and that will be one of my main arguments, in one way, it will become a kind of global object as soon as it's kind of placed, decided as being a heritage object. With the UNESCO World Heritage List as one of its motors, heritage has developed into a form of global infrastructure that serve an increasingly restless tourist. But on another level, UNESCO's World Heritage List has globalized the notion of a common heritage protected for the well-being of all. The protection of heritage by different national and global institutions has become such an integrated part of our thinking that we often overlook its historical specificity in the Western world. The ongoing exploitation of preservation policies beyond the West, under the name of culture, history, ecology, heritage, is part of a globalization of a notion that emerged in the formation of modern Europe around 1800. And as heritage and conservation laws are developing to become stronger regulators, we have to acknowledge how conservation policies and preservation objectives now form the physical environment and direct its economic to an increasing extent. And on the other hand, what I also have wanted to underline, preservation has been part of establishing an engagement and participation in the physical environment. This popularization and expansion of heritage in contemporary society, I would argue, is closely bound to a notion of loss and danger, also to crisis. To become a monument, objects has first to be at risk, in danger. Not until the object is threatened, homeless, on the edge of demise, does it qualify itself for protection and gain its status as a monument. Saved, it becomes defined by the apparatus of heritage, laws, profession, charters, and campaigns. I mean, this is the case. This is kind of identified as being in danger. Something is changing here, it's threatened by development, tourism, and so on. And this suggests a rethinking of the quality that traditionally identified a monument, such as permanence, monumentality, and aesthetics. And rather it is the opposite of these qualities that single certain objects out for eternity, qualities such as fragility, disintegration, and destruction. As fragile and exposed, this monument is in need of professions, schools, and international charters and organizations, and legal bodies for its being. It is constructed through a whole set of regulatory practices. And my question in some way is, where is architecture in all this? And where is also architecture schools? And what I think is a super urgency to establish a kind of critical discourse on conservation. The whole kind of field has kind of been established very much as in this kind of background of a crisis, of an urgency. And I think it has its backing, so to say, and now it really needs to be criticized and also nearly deconstructed. And we have established, when I was appointed professor in the Oslo School of Architecture, coming in some way from architecture theory into this field, I identified in some way 3 areas that we wanted to kind of work through. And one was the kind of establishment of a critical discourse. And that we have done in this Oslo Center for Critical Studies in Architecture. And here critical is used in the sense of being urgent, and also critical, but they are urgent studies. And we want to maintain within this a kind of very, we can say in some way, nearly traditional Tafurian perspective of being critical, standing on the side, not being in some way projective, but suggesting that the cases we use are so urgent, so they will influence other discussions. But we need here a kind of working through certain kind of concepts. And I've been working with the book I'm coming out now, The Fragile Monument, is trying to work through objects such as authenticity, originality, authorship, all those kind of concepts that hang in conservation very strongly. Or if we also have a project working through in some way preservation in the Scandinavian welfare states and the kind of turning point around 1970s when we move into liberal planning and seeing in some way where the preservation took its own direction there. And to just in relationship to this image, we can say that there we are not kind of interested maybe in the restoration objects as such. I mean, it's not so much how you put stones together, even if that of course is extremely interesting, but more like, for example, you see the screen in front of the preservation of the Noto Cathedral, and we are interested in some way the promise of this screen, and the use of the image here, and also of course the kind of the scribble on the bottom, what has been erased out. On another level, we have also established a post-professional master in conservation and urbanism, and here it's very different. Here it's very much more projective. Here we have a nearly utopian idea of bringing people who are already out in practice into the school and try to educate to kind of or kind of raise up a kind of discussion. And here we emphasize very much the issues of processes and stakeholders. And here, for example, you have an image of Oslo, a project. It's a kind of Oslo is a fantastic case study just now because it's really going through strong transformations. And in that, it's been a huge conflict between the kind of heritage community and urban planners. It's kind of very traditional kind of conflicts down between them, and that's been extremely important, therefore, to kind of go in and understand that conflict and identifying where it comes from. And for example, now this project is the Munch Museum. Here's the Snöhätta's opera, who was working as a kind of this is the first monument built here. Should be kind of pulling in people into the site. It has actually worked very successfully as a monument in that sense. People are now getting engaged on the top or being arrested for having sex on the top here, and it's kind of used in a kind of it kind of entered into the kind of narrative of the city in a very, very successful way. And then one can of course judge it. I mean, discuss it, its backside or not, and so on. But it has worked very well. And as part of this, and the strong idea is to bring it down. It's very kind of also problematic, actually. I mean, they're emptying out all the institutions in the city and they bring them down here. All the museums in Oslo now are moving around. It's also, they have money to do things like that. And the Munch Museum, the national figure Munch who gave all his kind of paintings to the city of Oslo, he testamented all his painting to the city of Oslo, and the city of Oslo has had problems to kind of space enough to show them. And it's of course the main tourist attraction also. And here was a project by Herreros architects, and that was cancelled. I mean, after long debate. It was just before Christmas now. The project is cancelled, and I think actually it's kind of killed. And the people who done that, or it's actually the head of the National Heritage Trust, who has worked very much with that. This is the old constructed fictional edge of Oslo in medieval time. They have kind of resettled in a kind of idea of here was where the city finished before. And in the 1930s there was an excavation here, and they found a couple of stones from the medieval time where they rumbled together, they built up a kind of fictional wall. And here has been a lot of arguments that you should be able to stand here and look out over the fjord, and then seeing a set of series of historical monuments that in some way turn you into a Norwegian person, or understanding your background. And then this is in the way. This kind of shadows the view. So here's been an argument coming from the heritage groups that argues just the city as a kind of visual image. There's no discussion about program or functions or anything like that. It's just the kind of the idea about the vistas and images. And things like that have been very important for us to kind of discuss through and understand. And it's been really interesting to do that also with the group of students coming in from, I mean, they're working in the kind of different bureaucracies around heritage. And the third, oh, this was very dark. The third bit that I've been very engaged in is the issue about design. And I insisted in some way, we are now in the history and theory and form department, who traditionally doesn't have, they don't have studio courses. But they have always a little bit of preservation because the historians take care of that. And there was this kind of studio that I developed into a kind of proper master studio, we call Restore. And there we work very much with alteration as an iteration as the main thing. And we chose alteration because we didn't want to use the term transformation, who has a kind of quite a lot of history also in Norway, in Oslo, with architect Sverre Fehn, who has done fantastic projects who are about transformation, where you come in as an architect in a historical building and you identify yourself very much as the new. You make contrast. And we had wanting here to work in a slightly different way, going in and kind of making small or sometimes large alteration. And we actually took the term alteration from, I have a dry cleaner around the corner from where I live, it says dry cleaning and alteration. And I thought that kind of making small shifts and changing. And this has also been a discussion about how conservation comes in the architecture education. And also how architecture history enters into architecture education. And we have taken this as a kind of also ground research in some way to kind of challenge the idea about history as the kind of idea about authorship and an intent who is materialized in the building. And the task of conservation is to bring back that relationship. And rather thinking about the building as a kind of group of authors, where also maybe time is part of one of the bits to change the buildings. And we have kind of learned a lot from conservation in the thing of being very obsessed with the material and also with mapping. And mapping in detail the building. Mapping is kind of materiality also. But in the same time, with this kind of very quasi kind of objective mapping, we have also worked with trying to meet the building on a kind of individual kind of basis, kind of with vested interest and desires, so to say. So we have worked both between the kind of objective and the kind of personal. This is just from... I think I could finish there in some way and giving time for the discussion. But to say as a kind of end thing, I think it's extremely important that architecture and urban planning enters into a conservation and preservation. It's too of a big task to leave outside. And it's been, I think it's been very interesting when I did this work of bringing together the urban planners and conservation group together in this post-professional master. That was a very big people very nervous from urban planning that they should enter into conservation. This is the old stuff. The people like old buildings. But it's much more kind of dynamic and complex to leave over to that side. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Tauris. My proposal, we have about 20 minutes for discussion, so we have quite a lot of time. And my proposal is that we actually collect a few questions at once. You can pose them to both or either panelist. And then I'll turn it over to them, and they can respond as they see fit to whichever questions or all. And maybe we can do a couple rounds of that. So if you could kindly just identify yourself and then give us your question, and I'll collect a few, and then we'll just turn it over. So the floor is open. Yes, thank you.
In the Netherlands,
If you could just identify yourself, please.
Larry Bluestone, urban designer. In the Netherlands, when national, regional, local planning was discussed. Could you just give a background on the role that the EU plays in planning?
Yep, thank you. Lukasz. I'll come to you next.
Okay.
Yes, thank you, and then we'll go back to you.
Is it working? Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Good morning. My name is Ivan Shumko. I wanted to ask you, I was very impressed by the presentation on the Netherlands urban planning. I'm thinking whether there's any similar initiatives for European Union in general, whether every country does their own urban design and planning, or there is some broader initiatives which kind of combine research from one country with implementation in another, and in general, what's the status of the whole Europe in this regard? Thank you.
Łukasz Pancewicz, MIT DASP. Yesterday, Michel Provost identified a very interesting issue of urban design being subjected to the play of capitalism. He was kind of a part of the bigger process of producing new towns. Hank, you said that politics really can play important roles. So how politics and governance can really negotiate or mitigate or empower designers to face this pressure of capitalism?
Diane Davis, GSD. I wanted to follow up on those prior two questions and pose a concern about the scales of regulation and whether there are conflict between the scales of regulation. I found it interesting in the second presentation. Well, the first presentation focused on politics, the second presentation focused on UNESCO, an international agency, that it has a regulatory capacity that it imposes on, within a nation state or within a city, and whether we could hear a little more about the conflicts and controversies about different scales of regulation in the city.
Maybe take one more? One other question before we turn it over? Yes, thank you.
I'm Adrian Blackwell, teaching urban design. I had a question inspired by the Battle of Orgrave and Jeremy Deller's sort of historical look at the beginning of neoliberalism in Thatcher's Britain. And it's about the double track of design and politics. So the first part of it is this a neoliberal agenda? It certainly seems to be, in terms of its adaptive and uncertain politics, its decentralization and deregulation, its offense over defense, its ambitious, technical, and opportunist form of politics. And then the next part is the neoliberal agenda still viable, or is it still brave? In the face of the economic crises and environmental crises it's precipitated, and the current revolutions and movements against it. And the third part of it is the marriage of design and politics, to paraphrase Walter Benjamin, a designing of politics or a politicization of design?
Nice. So now that we have a few very simple, great questions, maybe we'll turn it back over to the panel for some illumination. Tauris, do you want to go first, or I don't know, who wants to go first?
I can say something about this thing with scale of regulation. I think this, I didn't know if I got that true, but I think it's extremely complex. I mean, you talk about heritage very much in terms of memory and the local in some way, and identity. That was coming up yesterday also, this discussion about how now you should create identities, you know. And in the same time as you have that, you have, I should say, it is an issue about global. I mean, it is not so much, I mean, the heritage now works more about the global than local identities. And of course, it's kind of movement between those two. But in the sense of scale, I think that has been really scaled up.
Does the national play any role in that dialogue?
I think that has been kind of really pressed down, I think, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the national, I mean, that's also how I often have talked about the monument as a national object. And I should say that was so all the way to the, you know, I shouldn't give times, but like up to the 1950s. But now I think that the monument is not any longer an issue about the national primarily. It is primarily an issue about the global.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Thank you. Hank.
I want to start with the last question, of course, Adrian. Your two questions, actually. It's both and something else. So it's not the designing of politics or the politicizing of design alone. Of course, they're both true at the same time. But what makes it powerful is that it's the reflectiveness on both in position, out of a design perspective. So it's not a choice as you position it. There's no choice. There's more. So in that sense, to your first question, the neoliberal one, this whole notion on design and politics, on adaptiveness, didn't start with the liberalization or neoliberalization in the Netherlands. It started years back. It did not start under economic pressure. It started under a prosperous age where we forgot how prosperous we were. So although it caught fire again in this neoliberalistic approach, but it's more sustained in that sense than that it is an idea that just came up in current times. So that's the political perspective, because that's out of the political experience. Is it a neoliberal agenda? That's a question. I'm not convinced, because it questions too hard politics to actually become neoliberal. So, EU questions on Europe. That's difficult. If you look back, the only thing EU planners came up were bananas and other fruit type of drawings, which is not planning at all. The problem with the EU level when it comes to policymakers is that they don't know what they're talking about. So that's a big issue, because if you position a banana on a map and you confront it with the city of Frankfurt or Amsterdam, they don't know what to do with it. So rules and regulations on that level, in that way, we could, get rid of. The second thing, so this is looking back. What you see now is that the two parts and partners within the EU, DG Region, so that's the Director General for Regional Development, and DG Culture, actually rethink their role. And that's interesting. So they do not come up with planning concepts as imposing them on a national or regional level, but they come up with more possibilities. DG Culture even suggests to invest 37% more, while you see on the national level in the whole of the Europe a reduction of the 37% when it comes to cultural investments. So there's a change in perspective on the EU. The second thing is, does this lead to a collaboration of national or regional politics on the EU level? Within the International Architecture Biennale and within this chairmanship of Denmark now of the European Union, we are organizing an urban summit where I try to collect my national counterparts, but it's very hard to get them. I'm doing a little research by, it's not, it turned out to be a research. I never thought of it. I'm visiting all my colleagues in Europe, planning people who are responsible for planning on the national level. And it's shocking. I was in Italy, and it really scared the hell out of me. The way planning is perceived on the national level. So I'm not that convinced that it will actually help our condition. But Well, we'll try. And then capitalism and developers, the combination between, it was, I forgot your name. Lucas, yeah. If politics can counter capitalism.
Not counter, rather like, you know, have to negotiate capitalism. Because you probably cannot counter it simply by politics, but let's say to empower the other party.
Yeah, but also this is an easy question with a huge answer, because it differs so much. The Zuidas, the south axis in the Netherlands, for instance, being the only or best example in the Netherlands of a capitalistic development approach, is now turned into, again, an almost total governmental project on a national level. And it went well this week, although the press conference is next week, that development will continue. So there will be, and there's a new contract on a big development like that between governments and developers. A contract that's much more flexible, a contract that's much more dependable through time, and a contract also that's much more driven by qualitative aspects of a day-to-day development business. So that's where it's going well. If you look at the Rotterdam Central District situation, which is around the city station, Rotterdam Central District is one of the high-speed train links in Europe. So you get in the train, you're in Paris in 2.5 hours or something. This is Rotterdam, the biggest harbor of Europe. This is Rotterdam where you could actually believe in, and there's no development. It all stalled. So this idea of development that is still there on the Zuidas, it's totally lacking in Rotterdam. So there, total different new initiatives take over. One of them is also engaged in as the main test site in the Biennale, where development just starts testing rules and regulations, testing these contracts, testing current politics, and then it becomes, I'm involved in that, and it becomes very sharp for local politics, because they have to step out of their rules and regulation reality and say, hey, wait, what's happening? This is not about bottom up or so, but this is just an initiative. 2 architects, zus, in a building, wanting to redevelop it, and saying, well, you can't tear it down because we're adding quality and therefore adding a city to your city where nothing is happening. And the municipality is scared shitless, and they say, well, but my rules and regulations say that I have to tear down the building within 5 years, and then I only have 1 year to go, and what am I going to do? And then they look at national government and say, can we bend the rules? And this connection with government on this very specific level, on a national scale, is taking place much more often. That bending the rules is the only way to give room for this new contract between design, developers and government. And the only thing I'm scared of is that we institutionalize the bending of the rule, and it becomes a rule. And then there's nothing to bend anymore. So it's this, again, you have to reinvent your reflection upon the existing and never institutionalize this new invention.
Rahul, do we have time to do one more round? Yeah. Since Adrian Blackwell put the question of neoliberalism on the table, I can't help but just make a quick comment on that. I think it's an important issue for this panel in terms of thinking about the particular strategies and the sites of redevelopment and design and how they're embedded within a transformed regulatory environment. And just building on part of what Adrian said, from my point of view, the spatial essence of neoliberalism is less about, in a pure way, promoting marketized development than affirming territorial inequality. in contrast to a framework where states actively try to alleviate territorial and therefore social inequality at any spatial scale. So it's kind of a new formation of planning and regulation that's often described as fragmented and fragmentary. But in a way, it's fragmented within a broader national and even global context in which regulatory bodies, be it the UN or the World Bank or national states, are promoting internal spatial fragmentation. So a lot of the projects that Henk described, in which the Dutch state is actively targeting very specific zones for different kinds of purpose, some of which, like Saudas, are actively, capitalist, or at least were. And others of which have other kinds of infrastructural or social purposes. That's a different model of planning than what obtained across Western Europe and much of the world in different forms during the 1950s and 1960s, in which there was some sort of model of territorial equalization that at least ideologically obtained. And it's also an interesting question to think about how the preservation projects that Tauris is talking about fit into that, because you, and I think in a very interesting way, contextualize that in relationship, and you situated the UNESCO's projects of preservation as a kind of aftermath to the collapse of Sion and their sort of comprehensive vision of urban planning. So now it's kind of a world project of preservation, but it's still the question of how are the sites chosen and how are they embedded within a landscape that's constantly undergoing creative destruction through rounds of capital investment. And I don't know the answer to that, but it was interesting to me that one of your university's projects is looking at these preservation agendas in relationship to the evolving Scandinavian welfare state. So it seems like also for your work, the evolution of sort of cycles of state power and state regulation is also relevant as a way to contextualize these preservation projects, not just globally through UNESCO, but also through different national strategies. So there might be different national formations within which the types of preservation projects that you're discussing might emerge. So Scandinavia might be one model, or different countries within Scandinavia, and so forth. So those aren't specific questions, but just sort of building on the contextualizing moves that some of the previous comments made. So maybe there's time for just a couple more questions and comments, and then we give each of our panelists one more opportunity to speak.
Yes, this is a question for Hank, following on Neil's comments, which I think addressed it to some extent, on Joyce Rosenthal, the GSD. And I was wondering if you could elaborate on the trend of deregulation and decentralization. And is that just as Neil was describing neoliberal planning in a sense, or what are the spatial implications of your analysis of these trends for the Dutch? Thanks.
Thank you. I think there's a couple questions over here, Doug, on this side. Thank you. Let's go across. Thanks, Doug.
Hi, Peter Park, Loeb Fellow at GSD. My question has to do with public engagement. In the sense of, from two perspectives. You both talked about politics, and design. And so, what do, I'll say, the experts, the planners, learn from the community in terms of the community's aspirations? What does the citizenry want? And then your sense of what the community, what people think about in terms of their trust that the regulations will deliver to their aspirations. Just sort of the realm of the regulations sourced from people's opinions and then how they shape to their aspirations.
Actually, just to your left.
Hi, Arkin Ozai at GST. I had a question for Hank actually, and when you show that map of the sort of regulatory zones, and you mentioned your study with Adrian Hers about how actually that space actually a continuous landscape. I do think though there's some level of luxury that you enjoy in Netherlands that's much desired in the sort of in many of the sort of developing cities. If you follow the Rotterdam Biennale, if you look at cities like Sao Paulo, it's almost 20 million. Istanbul is 30 million. So I think in some ways the continuity of space actually somehow points to its continuity of governance and sort of planning goals as well at a national scale. You know, a country of what, 16 million or so, and the tradition of planning, as you mentioned, in places like Sao Paulo and Istanbul, where the tax base is actually not that deep to actually support building in that large scale or sort of planning goals, sort of consistent planning goals in regional and urban scale. The way it works is basically, you know, whenever there's a problem, sort of a quasi-governmental committee is sort of commenced, and they follow up on what they do, and they can actually sidestep much of the regulations and master plans, etc. And so the continuity of space is sort of completely lost in terms of cities. So I was wondering if you can perhaps talk about a little bit, you know, what's there to learn from the sort of the Dutch experience that could be translated into to sort of, you know, developing city regions.
Thank you, and it looks like there are a few more hands on this side. We can ask you to be relatively concise in the interest of giving our panelists a bit of time to respond before we go to the next panel. So we'll just take two. Yes, thank you.
Christian Rothman from the GSD. A very quick question about the relation between design politics and exhibitions like the IABR, and the model of basically curating projects that have long time spans, and then the sequence of these exhibitions that, like the IABR, is biannual. And how do you make a dent in these projects that go for a long time? And how do you guarantee the longevity of these projects, and not just that there is a certain, let's say, abuse of politics of the exhibition to show grand ambitions and then go back to business as usual?
Thank you, Christian. And right behind you, actually, we'll do one last question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Greg Haley. This is a question for Tauris. I'm wondering from your research whether you could elaborate on relations between the designation of heritage sites and issues of affordability and social equality in cities.
Sorry, last bit?
Affordability and social equality in cities relative to sort of landmarking heritage sites.
Yep, great. Thank you very much. So why don't we give each of our panelists an opportunity to reply. Tauris, would you like to go first, or should we ask? Hank, why don't you go first this time?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
Let's rotate.
Start in the back. You're Christian. Yeah. The abuse of the exhibition in a political level. Of course, there's this abuse. It's politics. There's always the abuse. So there's no guarantee, never, with or without an exhibition, that there is abuse. The other thing is that it's not an exhibition, the Biennale, so that makes it a little less vulnerable. It's a 2-year process that's going on for a couple of biennales already. So we engage not for an exhibit, we engage for the process. So and then I'll go to your question on Istanbul, or can we learn? By investing time and money in the Istanbul case, which is actually Arne Wuttke, for the last 2 years, development arouses. So this is not putting a project on the table with a spotlight on it and saying, well, look, what do we have here? No, this is an engagement with the university, an engagement with the municipality, an engagement with the water board for over 2 years now. And now, after these 2 years, through design, through reflection, a project emerges. Arne Wuttke is in the north. It will open up development because there's going to be a new bridge along the Bosporus. And this new main infrastructure doesn't help, eh? Should I just talk louder?
No, it's
working. Okay. This new main infrastructure will catalyze development. The only thing national politics has when it comes to planning is large squares on a map saying so many houses per square kilometer, square hectare. That's the only planning strategy there is. So if there's so many infrastructure added, there's so many crossroads, then you know for sure development will take place. So the only thing we did from the Biennale perspective is engage with local politics, engage with local developers, engage with the water company, and this design process came up with a development strategy. And why I'm convinced that it will not go away, because it's sustained in a political dialogue. It's sustained in the interests of the landowners. It's sustained in the interest of the water company. That this is a way to combine goals and interests. So it's the Biennale in that sense is not an exhibit that puts a spotlight on a project. It's a process of engagement. Am I certain? Never. Look at and even in the Netherlands, I mean, we discard projects, we discard investments, we turn things upside down when it comes to politics. So there's no way of guaranteeing political. There's no way of guaranteeing politics. On the other hand, and that's Joyce's question. I'm not sure if it was Joyce. About the neoliberal and the deregulation and decentralization. This is since the first spatial planning policy document, it has been about decentralization and deregulation. This is not new. We've been addressing issues on the regional and local scale from the beginning. And decentralization and deregulation were part of this national policy from the beginning. The only sharpness to it now is that we actually deregulate. It always was a promise, and now it became reality. So that's the neoliberal part of it. There's less on the national level than there was before, so it changed in that perspective. Yeah.
Thank you, Henk.
I will try to bring all these questions together and actually start with deregulation and
Microphone.
sorry, and I start with the deregulation and the neoliberal. And if I go back in some way to this case I've been researching in Stockholm, I think it's extremely interesting to look how a deregulation that took place in the 1970s actually, but the whole kind of building industry is deregulated and the planning system is deregulated at the same time as the heritage laws are reinforced. And then it's interesting to see how that in some way works over to in some way use of the existing buildings and so on by at large used in that kind of liberal politics as creating identities for new kind of areas, also the whole thing of creating, I mean, leaving behind in some way the big kind of housing projects and turning into the inner cities who become very exclusive in some way. So it's a part of reuse of history is also a part of a kind of neoliberal planning. So my point there is just this kind of increased regulation in some way of heritage and combined with a kind of very deregulated kind of planning system. And then I want to return also to this issue about the engagement, by the kind of engagement in the past that I talked about. And I think it's interesting because it's emerged a kind of critical discourse of conservation in the 1970s actually, and onwards. I mean, it's fantastic books like Francis Trouet's The Invention of the Historical Monument, for example, but they all are terrified in some way of this kind of popularization of heritage. They see this as a kind of very kind of negative kind of force in some way. It's become populistic, it become kind of politicized, it's become impure and so on. And I think that's actually interesting there to go in and see a kind of force in that. And I think it's interesting that kind of engagement actually exists. So there, I think it's that there I need to unmap that in some way. I think, yeah.
Excellent. Thank you both very much indeed. This was a...
I answered, I forgot about the trust and distrust.
Okay.
And perhaps that's the perhaps that's the neoliberalism part of it again, is that for the neoliberal perspective, a rule that is trusted is not needed. And if you actually take that a step further and you take those rules out, you partially take away the construct of rules and regulations. So that if you only start nibbling on rules because you think we don't need them, and that's the wrong perspective of neoliberalism when it comes to planning. That's not what's happening in the Netherlands, of course, because we're this luxury country, but it's a possibility. A rule has to be challenged, otherwise it's not in position.
Excellent. Thank you both very much indeed. Okay,